So we will move through the meeting as well as we can. I'm hoping that we will be able to conclude the public meeting by around noon, as we have then 2 items to discuss in private, which and members need to be away by 1. So, do we have any declarations of interest, particularly from new members of the committee, or any item that is on the agenda today? There are none. Thank you. The minutes of the last meeting, bearing in mind that there will be a more limited number of people who were here, has anyone seen anything on the minutes that they believe to be wrong or that they wish to ask about? We all agreed that they are then an accurate record of the meeting. Everyone's in agreement. Thank you very much. As the only matter arising that we've noted is just to have an update on the statement of accounts, and I think Ravi is going to just update us on that.
Yeah, so I'll be limited in what I say, only because I don't want to steal Constance and thunder. But just to say, kind of the audit of the draft statement of the 2021 accounts is substantially complete. There's a few outstanding items that need to be resolved. So the statutory deadline for uploading the accounts with the audit opinion is the 30th of September. Those issues will not be resolved by the 30th of September, so we'll put a notice on the website just to say the reason for the delay. And kind of Grant Thornton will probably go into that into a bit more detail. But yeah, like I say, kind of substantially complete with a few issues and hopefully will be resolved over the next few weeks.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. So reassured that there are no major hiccups, and we'll hear then when the audit is complete.
Yeah, anything that does change from this draft statement of accounts will update the joint audit committee in due course.
Any questions? Yes, Richard.
Ravi, is there any kind of implication or consequence of us filing late?
No, there's no fine or anything like that. And professionally, we always like to kind of meet the deadline, but for a variety of reasons, there's certainly no kind of cash implications or no implications on the PCC's budgets. There are accounting issues rather than kind of budget issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for that. In which case, we will move on to item 5, which is our regular risk management update. Now, we'll note that at the moment, the risk register for the Commissioner is, I would say it's in preparation, but actually it's the plan that's in preparation, and when the plan is prepared, then a new risk register will be compiled. I'll ask Mark just to update us on that, and then we'll move substantively to the Forces risk register. Mark.
Thank you, Chair. So the report briefly summarises where we are in terms of the police and crime plan, in terms of the consultation that's taken place over the summer until the plan being drafted at the moment. So the intention is the police and crime plan will go to the police and crime panel on the 18th of October. So what we will do is when we share that document with the police and crime panel, we'll share it with the audit committee as well. So it'll be more or less the final version, subject to crime panel's comments and obviously any comments from anybody else as well. So that'll enable the risk register to be completed, and we will bring that to the December meeting for obviously the do of it by the joint audit committee.
Thank you, Mark. So we'll try and make sure that there is adequate time on that agenda for us to give that a thorough examination. So then, Veronica. I'm dodging the equipment to see Veronica. Veronica, would you take us through, there are some changes in the Forces risk register. Could you just take us through your report, please?
Okay, thank you, Chair. So since the June Audit Committee, the corporate risk register for the Force has been refreshed and reviewed. A number of risks have been closed off, a number of risks have been added. We've added 6 risks. We've also changed the risk assessment methodology, so that's been added to the papers, and that's to ensure consistency score them across the board and reporting, because they were issues around consistency earlier in the year around how different portfolios and different departments were recording their risks. So we have one critical risk now. So the new scoring mechanism allows for risks that have been identified as critical and high, medium, low, and 5x5 methodology. We have one critical risk around skills, resilience and training, a number of high risks, a number of risks that were previously presented at the June JAT have remained stable, and I can just go through the list of 6 new corporate risks that have been added to the risk register, and they're around core skills, resilience and training, Section 22 governance, cyber security, police cadet leaders, safeguarding, and organisational learning and alarms management. What we will take from the document and from the risk register is that we hope to have the plan for the risk register to be a live document. So although we have these new risks sitting here and they've been updated and come to the September audit committee, by December there may be new risks added, there may be risks that are closed off, and it's to ensure that the document remains a live and dynamic document, and that as we build in new risk management approach and process, that there will be action plans in place to reduce a number of the risks that sit in as critical or high. As some of these have been added quite recently, it will take time to embed the action plans to reduce and mitigate the risk. So although some of these risks may be recorded as high or critical, the plan is that by the next joint audit committee, these risks will be mitigated downwards, if not closed off. We have some of the risks have also been closed or amalgamated into risks that were sitting on the risk register previously. So the changes that we made previously, we had a risk ops, PLATO embedding, and that's now operational training and embedded learning around JESUP, command training, and jobs, and that's really around following the incident we had last year with the rewarding stabbing that we had in Birmingham. We've revised the recruitment and retention stroke uplift risk, and that now focuses more on recruitment and retention risk and the uplift. And corporate health, safety and wellbeing, that's incorporated elements of the COVID organisational risk that we previously had, and it focuses more on the strategy we have around staff wellbeing and health and safety for police officers and police staff. Investigative and criminal justice process and outcome, that's incorporating criminal justice backlog cases and the changes to the Attorney General's disclosure guidance. Mutual aid and resourcing, that was previously the Commonwealth Games resourcing risk due risk register. This now incorporates where we have major events that we plan for and the resourcing around it, and the mutual aid requirements. So that also, so this particular risk does include the COP26 climate change conference later on this year, and WMP demographics and representation, previously named WMP demographics and legitimacy in communities. This has been slightly amended to focus on our key priorities around representation of our force for the communities we serve.
Thank you very much. Are there any initial questions from members? Richard?
Thanks, Veronica. I think you answered my question I had, which was, are the new risks replacing your kind of the close hold on, so that's helpful. I just found the way you present the information, the new risks appear to be at the high end of risk exposure. And I just wondered, are they just inherently high, or is that because the controls and mitigations we've got are particularly effective, or just to shed some detail on that?
So some of the risks are on the high side, and that's following some of the mitigation that's been put in place. And because they are new, these are risks that have recently been placed on the corporate risk register, and because of the way things are now scored, the plan is, as we now embed the process, the work I'll be doing across the course is to look at the action plans for these particular risks, so that, you know, we don't just have risks that sit on the risk register. It's to go out and speak to different portfolios and ask them what's actually happening with these risks, what's the action plan that we put in place to mitigate these risks and to reduce them down. And hopefully some of them, for example, the mutual aid, which is the element of COP26 by the December Jack, that will have come off, but however the risk will inherently stay there until after the
Okay, it will go up with the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah.
Thank you. I guess what my line of thinking, and it sounds like you're going in the same direction, is that the control information on the table that you give us is narrative, and it would be helpful to get some sense of how good the controls are, so some sort of judgment or grading about the controls, so we can see from the inherent when the mitigation is applied, what's the residual risk. So I think as a direction of travel, I think it would be helpful to get some sort of grading or judgment about how good the controls are, rather than just a narrative description.
And that's something we can include, because at the moment we only include the trend and the residual risk grading, so you can actually see where some of them have probably been graded critical initially as the gross risk and have been mitigated down to, although it's still high, there is, on the full risk register, there is a difference between what's, you know, the inherent risk environment and what's been put in place to mitigate it down. So that can be included too.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of questions, Chair. Thank you for your hard work on this, Veronica. The questions I might ask might actually be answered by Mark and the Deputy, so I'll just throw them out there and we'll see who picks them up. The first one is about policing cadet leaders. Cadets. There's obviously an issue there about the safeguarding policies, but there's an issue around recruiting cadet leaders. Are we sure that we're not over-recruiting cadets and finding ourselves in a position where we haven't got enough leaders then to ensure the safeguarding is in place?
Before anyone answers that, I'm going to hang something on the side of that, if I can, Kat, because I had a theory about this risk, and it was about what the risk actually is. Because having responsibility for safeguarding in many other places, I would say that if we're not following best practice with our policies and procedures, the risk is not that we get ticked off for it. The risk is that we're actually missing vulnerabilities in our cadets and that we're not spotting incidents where they are at risk. So the risk is far more serious than, you know, we might be embarrassed by not having the right processes. It's that if we've not got the right processes, our cadets are at risk.
Take that?
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks, Kat. And I'll answer the first bit, but I will come on to the second part. As a force, as you know, we place very, very high regard on our cadets and think they're an absolutely fantastic opportunity for us to engage with people. And we have very much focused on our most underrepresented communities and our most deprived communities to source our cadets, because it's such a fantastic. I think we could, I know we could probably tenfold increase our number of cadets if we wanted to, such as the desire in the community for the scheme. But we've been very, very mindful, and you're absolutely right, Kath, that the challenge is the cadet leaders and having the right number of leaders to safeguard, but also to lead effective groups. So we do not recruit cadets unless we have the leaders in place. And we're very clear around that, and we have lots of schools contacted us, because most of them are based in schools wishing to pursue a cadet group, but we control it very, very carefully, which is why with the last commissioner, the target of 500 cadets which he set for us to achieve, it took us quite some time to do it, not because the numbers weren't there, but because we needed to have the leaders in place. So just to give you some reassurance, we don't set up a group unless we have the leaders in place, so we don't put ourselves in the The risk, Chair, you may or may not be aware of a cadet leader in Greater Manchester Police who has been jailed recently for abusing cadets, which is where this risk, because what it did, it caused us all to go and re-look at our safeguarding policy. So we didn't have any inherent concerns about our policy, but that made us, as we should rightly do, reflect and go away and have a look. And what we found was that we can, as you would expect, there's always improvements that we can make, and that's why I wanted this risk on the register to recognise that West Midlands Police takes the safeguarding of its cadets extremely seriously, and anywhere that we can see an opportunity to improve, and that's why this risk is here following that was identified. It wasn't quite clear.
Are you happy, Kat, with that? Okay. Yeah, have you got another?
I've just got two
Okay.
quick ones. So nationally, there's a real focus now on violence against women and girls, and it's been likened to a national crisis similar to dealing with terrorism. In light of that, in light that we're reviewing the risk policy, would we be looking to put forward into the corporate risk register to show that step change in the prioritising it within West Midlands?
I'll take that. So at the Strategic Peace and Crime Board yesterday, there was a specific presentation on the approach that West Midlands Police is taking in relation to violence against women and girls, and the specific strategy that has been written, the dedicated strategy, and all the work that is ongoing. I think that, we are very clear, as is the government and as an organisation, as to where we want to go with violence against women and girls, and the priority that it sees, the priority that we set it here in West Midlands. I think it's something we can consider. I think the question would be, is it a risk that's a societal risk, which I think it is, and we are approaching it with a very specific strategy with dedicated staff in order to address some of the issues. So I don't think the risk is that West Midlands Police is not taking violence against women and girls seriously. I think we have a strategy, it's been developed, it's been recognised as a strong one, it was endorsed by the Commissioner yesterday. I think the risk is society's approach to violence against women and girls. So I'm not sure that it would sit on the risk register at the moment. I think if our strategy was not delivering, or we had some serious concerns about the lack of impact that the strategy was having, then yes, I think that would be relevant. But I think at the moment, because we are developing this and we are waiting for the public consultation from the government to come through, to see it through, it's more like a broader societal issue.
I'd just turn that on its head then and say, at some point, could we have a report that explains why it's not on there?
Yeah.
And then that would lay out all the issues about either where the positive change that's happened or the positive change that needs to happen.
So I think if it's Chair, if it's okay, what we would do is put that through the process that we would do to, when we're considering all our risks, and to see whether it's appropriate for it to go on. And if the decision is not at this moment, it doesn't hit, then absolutely come back and explain to you why we don't. Or in fact, if Veronica assesses it as in our normal systems and processes, we put it on. That's a fair way to do it, to say, not saying no, but we'll go through the right process.
And it's very clear that we'll follow that through and get the answer.
Yeah.
And just very quickly, on the previous risk register, there was commentary made on CRR 20, which is about information management. And within the impact there is mention about an SLA change regarding RAPO, and the assessment's going from 28 days to 56 days for CPS to assess cases to go into corporate charging. Now, I know that was discussed at Fine Government, and it's been discussed somewhere else in the system. But the answer is no, that's not correct. I just think somewhere that needs revising and putting into the risk. It's down as a closed risk, but I don't think that's actually true. Okay. Or it's not reflective of where we were then, and I'm hoping it's not reflective of where we are now. So that just needs revisiting. Okay.
And I think elements of that have been included in the criminal justice and the backlog risk. So it's just because it's been summarised, that probably hasn't been included in the summary narrative on the risk register. That element of the information management was risk from the June risk register.
It's just making sure that that's actually a true statement. I'm not sure it is. Thank you.
Okay, well, we will clearly be focusing on a number of issues to do with rape and sexual offences. Further reports that we have on the agenda, so we will pick that up as well. Okay, yes, Deepinder.
Thanks, Chair. Just for my knowledge, it may sound like a silly question here, but I'm a little bit confused. We've got here 6 new corporate risks, 2.6. I've got the last one, alarms management. If it's outdated, or to risk of it being outdated, which result in delays, replacing it, even that upgrade, why is it just being picked up now? Should this have not even been on the radar? Should we have not picked this up straight away that it's going to be outdated and it's being replaced, rather than put us in this position?
I think that's something that was put on the risk register earlier this year, so it was put on after the last chapter. It has been on the risk register for a number of months. I think as the new process embeds, we are working, the force is working through how things are escalated up to the corporate risk register. So it's probably something that's been sitting on a portfolio risk register, but needed to go through the escalation process, which is what we're working through now. And this may be something that will come off the risk register in December, because some of the risks do become business as usual. But I think it's been put on the corporate risk register to have that oversight at the executive level. But it has been something that's been important.
How long it's been sitting on the register for?
I can get that to you.
I think there's more of a point of what is the forces and CCC's programme of building renewal and maintenance, and our alarms central part of that. Would there not be a programme that said if alarms are going to get out of date, this is the point at which we have to replace them? So it's not so much when did it get on the risk register as what is there a reason that it hasn't been possible to replace the alarms? Which isn't a question for Veronica.
There is a proxy board what considers issues like this. So I'm sure it's been raised at that proxy board and work is going on.
So maybe what we will say on that particular risk is, if the risk is still in this state for December, it would be helpful to have some feedback on how it's being managed by the property board and what the schedule is for renewal of the alarm. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. One final thing then, Veronica. The new members of the committee have had some training in risk matters and being an effective audit committee, which is always a dangerous thing for officers to hear. One of the questions that was posed to the members of the committee by our trainer was about the risk appetite and about the input that the audit committee had into thinking about the risk appetite in the force. So it's good to see that thinking is happening, but we would like to have that thinking shared with us and have some input in it. So could we have a specific item to the next agenda in which someone will actually come to us and talk to us about the process that you've followed, the decisions that you've made, and some thinking around that, so that we can actually give our input into that and see if we are assured by it, or whether we've got any questions on the sorts of choices that are being made. Yeah.
I think as Veronica outlined last time, the putting in place the risk appetite statement for the force is a relatively new initiative, endeavour, and we are due to take it back into the executive team in the next few months for a look again. So I think it would be timely to bring it into this committee. I think the question is whether it's part of the public agenda or the private.
I'm perfectly happy to have a conversation about whether it's something that happens in a public agenda, public committee meeting, or whether it's another part of offline discussions and training session or whatever with the audit committee members. But I think actually it would be very helpful for us to have discussed it and had some input into it before it goes back to the executive. So if we can think about the timing for that would be good.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, a sort of training session that steps through its place in our processes would also be very helpful.
Yes. Okay. Good. Thank you. Okay. I think that is all then on the risk register and the risk management update. So we will move on to the update on Her Majesty's Inspectorate activity. Rachel, welcome.
Morning, everybody. As you will probably be aware from the size of the paper, there's been a significant period of activity with HMIC nationally and within the board. We are now at the point in our field inspection where we take it back to the planning, which began last November, and we're all at 12 months on. We've had our on-site evidence gathering and we've had our brief back and forth from the executive in July, which has given us some things to and we are now heading towards publication of the report, which will be early December. We've had a draft report back into force to look at spend checking, accuracy, data checking. To consider the response back to HMIC and arrest imminently. And then that will progress until November. And in this interim phase, we also have an opportunity to look at the recommendations that are likely to be signed off through that appeal report. Early indications are there's going to be a number of recommendations signed off in various portfolio areas. And the HMIC have come in and sat with us and actually gone through our recommendations at the moment and said, we can see if there are plenty of these which are going to be signed off with a little bit of extra work. A number will definitely be signed off. There are a larger number that just need a bit more conversation and discussion with leads and a little bit of guidance from us to take. We will have, by the end of the year, hopefully, quite an opportunity for us to really consider what we'll be left with, and as we've been talking about risk, how we're going to incorporate some of those recommendations onto the joint governance structures. In terms of the wider piece of thematic inspection, we've been really busy this year, and we have had 6 thematic. Whilst we haven't been the direct focus of the jury, we've been involved through data collection, some of which they incorporated from our field data, and certainly issues around violence against women and girls, some of our data collection. And looking to the future, in terms of future inspections, we now know that we will be subject to violence in young people early next year as one of the 12 inspectors for. The work's already started around that to look at what we have outstanding in terms of recommendations, how that works with our current BRU structure, and what else we might want to be considering a wider piece across the UK. So looking outwards as well as looking inwards. When we look at the inspections that have happened over the course of the last few months, there's been a real emphasis around, obviously, violence against women and girls, rape, day slavery, and we could go through all of them if you'd like me to, or I don't know if the board members have an opportunity to read the paper and then just want to go direct to questions because of what to use.
Yes, I think you can be assured that members will have read the paper. Unless there's something you particularly want to highlight, we'll move to questions. But okay. Are there then any questions from members on paper?
Just regarding the interim report for how the police effectively engage with women and girls. The last line on there talks about a 3-year strategy. If there was one, change that was to be highlighted, that's going to affect women and girls today and tomorrow for the rest of the week. The one that was highlighted out of it, rather than it being, a 3-year strategy, which will just kind of roll along.
One deliverable from the strategy.
Yeah, one that's going to make a difference today and tomorrow, as opposed to, waiting for that 3 years. So I'm not sure that there is one, it's such a complex issue. I think what I would say is that we're absolutely not looking that it will take 3 years to deliver the strategy. There will be key deliverables every quarter, as we move along the process. I think it's so fundamental in terms of you know, society's approach to violence against women and girls, if you start very early in schools, from an education point of view, about the way our young people are educated, you know, right the way through to, you know, sort of the violence that exists against women and girls. I'm not sure there is one. I mean, I'm happy to share the strategy with you for comments, Kath, and you know, and to, you know, really value your views on it. But I'm not sure there's a single thing that is here and now that is going to make that fundamental difference, because I think this is so complex. It's a series of, you know, sort of iterative processes that we need to go through.
I know later on in the paper, and I'm probably stepping a little bit ahead here, for example, succession planning of BASO officers, you know, that doesn't seem to have been well organised. Is there a plan, for example, or what's the plan to make sure that the BASO teams have the staff they need to do the job that they do?
Can we wait for Annie to come in later on to cover that?
But
It's
just that linking one to the other. Really.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we'll deal with it then. Okay. I was interested to see that HMIC were doing a piece of work on neurodiversity. Is this the first time that anyone has actually looked at the incidence of neurodiversity? I don't even know whether it is about incidence of neurodiversity, but is about actually how the criminal justice system ensures that people with neurodiversity issues, you know, are actually fairly treated and given a callback. But is this the first time it's been looked at?
So it's been in previous inspections, and I think, remember, it's 2015 where it comes to earlier inspection. I think this is really the first one where it's been an involved piece of work where it's led by people with neurodiversity, actually a guide and how we do business better. Really unique piece of work.
So, I mean, I know from my previous roles in mental health services how often the people who are in mental health secure establishments have neurodiversity issues of some sort, and we had whole wards that in the end were devoted to people who were on that spectrum. I mean, beginning to recognise the problem and to look for it is one thing. Having the resources to be able to then ensure that your systems meet those needs is quite another, and it, you know, it brings up the spectre of another whole range of training, and so it would be very interesting to see what, I mean, I'm not asking for anybody to give an answer to that, but it would be very interesting to see how that comes through in the plans in the force, and what emerges from it.
Yeah. It was brought up during the COVID, the officer's COVID custody. That's all about really how much.
Any questions from anyone else? Thank you very much, Rachel, for that. And then we've got a follow-up from the discussion that we had at the last meeting about some of the variances that are identified in HMI CLRS. It's too much of a mouthful. In value for money, and we at our last meeting we picked out a couple of areas where it appeared we were an outlier, either an over or an underspender. Not I only mean in comparison with other people. So we have a paper on those specifics, and I think Beth, can you present that to us?
Yeah. So following on from the last one, you asked us to look at advanced public order, which were an outlier of about £5.20 and with similar forces. And then response management, where we're about £60.64, so quite significantly below the average around those similar forces. And to put into context, to understand the reasons for the outliers in both these areas, we need to understand the work that we've done over the last sort of 5-6 years on the changes to the operating model and our shift, and our deliberate shift to a more corporate deliberate way of that policing activity. So from an advanced public order point of view, the sort of table in the report shows that around 2016-17, be shot up from being around the same as our missing forces to about £5.20 more. That was around the time that we introduced our new force capability of force support unit. Following this up, we had some conversations with operational leads in this area, and we've established that a more accurate way of splitting up the costs of that force support unit was to be splitting it 3 ways between neighbourhood, response and advanced public order. So that would bring our gap down to about £5.20 to £1.38. We will still remain in that way because we are one of the only forces in the country, if not the only force, to have this dedicated force support unit. And then outlier 2 response was a little trickier to sort of dig into the detail of. But again, up until around 2015-16, we were popular in the same sort of trajectory as our similar forces. And both ourselves and Manchester had about 1,300 response officers. And then again, in between 2015-16 and 2018-19, changes happened. So again, our operating model centralised our force response unit and took out a number of posts and diverted them into force CID. And I think a number of them also went into that force support unit. At the same time, Manchester's shift in focus moved more to local delivery and integrated delivery of their neighbourhood policing through local bases, and they actually put 1,000 more officers into response. And when you look at their job title, their officers, they call neighbourhood policing officers, but they map to response. But they actually have responsibility for problem solving and understanding their community and current issues, identifying and tackling repeat demands with colleagues and partners, providing that proactive capability to self-use, and then also the responsibility of less serious investigations, prisoner processing and attending appointments. So a lot of that activity is done by our neighbourhood policing team, our force CID team, our force support team. I think the final bit to add is just that as part of our review, we have this financial year started to add an extra 252 officers. So again, that's slightly more.
Thank you. I think we all felt, as we read it, that this is a very clear explanation of how the differences arise in what we're seeing between our force and others. But then that poses another question, doesn't it? Which is, if we're organising very differently, what's the evidence for which of those organisational models work? Or is it very much about local context being the key issue? And that's more of a question for, you know, how much information are force commanders passing between each other and thinking, actually, that might work in Manchester, but what we're doing really works for the West Midlands. So how far is that sort of self-examination of those differences in organisation going on?
Well, I can probably speak very personally, having just come from Greater, well, not just a while now, 2.5 years ago, come from Greater Manchester Police. And it is a very, very different policing model, as really, sorry Beth, really well described in the paper. And I think, you know, that I certainly have a lot of conversations still with Greater Manchester. I think none of us would want to be in the position that Greater Manchester is in at the moment, in terms of, you know, if we talk about HMIC and some of the activity that's going on there. My personal view, coming to West Midlands, is that ours is a very solid structure. We have invested heavily in our neighbourhood policing and dedicated neighbourhood policing officers, accepting in times of need, summer demand, you know, we do draw on those. But what you have in Manchester is a much bigger group of people that are called neighbourhood policing officers. But within that function, you have response, you have investigate, you know, so that does account for the difference. The force support unit here that Beth has just described is a great function because it was always a real source of frustration, I felt, in Manchester, that you would come on in the morning to parade on with a list of tasks, only to be told you need to go to a scene over there because, you know, whereas we don't have that because we have this dedicated resource, so you can concentrate on what your day actually is. there are pros and cons, you know, but I think that this is a very strong and solid model. There is no intention at the moment to move away from that model. There's a huge cost involved in changing models, as you can imagine, disruption to the organisation. I think we are in constant dialogue with Greater Manchester Police, from the Chief Constable level, you know, down to operational. We have that because we are very similar. So just to reassure you, Chair, we do have the conversations. Different operating contexts at the moment between both forces, but it is something that we do look at very.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful and knowledgeable. That's helpful. And just to underline what we did say when we posed these questions at the last meeting, that being an underspender against the norm or an overspender against the norm is not necessarily a bad thing. You know, it's not necessarily something that needs to be eliminated. It's just something that we need to understand why, and the why may be perfectly reasonable, and therefore you don't need to pull out all the stops to reduce the variation, because it's the right thing for us to be doing. Thank you, Beth, very much, and thank you for the explanation. I haven't seen anybody else indicating, so we'll then move on again to the Treasury Management update. Ravi.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a kind of brief reminder, particularly for the newer members of the board, about what Treasury Management is. It's effectively the management of the PCC's borrowing, investment and cash flows in its banking, money market and capital transactions, and it's the effective control of our cash flows that's you know, suitable for our kind of risk appetite and is consistent with those risks. So kind of section 3 of the report provided an economic and interest rate forecast. The reason for providing that forecast is because what's happening in the economy will drive the Bank of England's interest rates, and the Bank of England's interest rate drives the rate at which the PCC can borrow money but also invest money. So that's the kind of context behind that really. So the Bank of England expects inflation to peak at over 4% during 2021. The key question at the moment is whether that's going to be temporary or whether that's going to result in permanent inflation. And clearly the Bank of England use interest rates as a tool to you know, control inflation, of which their target is 2%. And you know, the particular issues around the kind of labour market and whether those people that left the labour market during the kind of COVID crisis are going to return on a permanent basis. There's also an issue of kind of spare capacity in the economy, and that's being, you know, you can see it everywhere in the economy at the moment, whether that's going to kind of push inflation up, and also households have built up savings during the COVID pandemic, and that's kind of, you know, resulting in kind of excess demand. So that kind of moves us on to the interest rate forecast. Link, our Treasury Management advisors, have forecast that interest rates are going to start to rise in the first quarter of 2023, from the current rate, which is 10 basis points, moving to 25 basis points in quarter 1 of 23, and then 50 basis points, so 0.5% in March 24. And you'll see from the table in 3.5 that the PWLB, which is the Public Works Loan Board, the organisation from which the PCC would borrow money from, forecasting interest rates to increase over that time. So overall, the kind of balance of risk for the EU is the upside, although there's still residual risk from COVID variants, both domestically and potential effects worldwide from various shortages. Moving on to section 4, which is our annual investment strategy. So just a reminder really is that our number one priority with our cash flow is security of capital, then liquidity, and then yield, return on our investment really. So we only invest at the moment with counterparties up to 12 months. We won't invest in anything longer than 12 months. So 4.4 shows where our current investments are. So we had 79 million in the instant access with NatWest, 30 million with the money market funds, 85 million pounds investments, which I'll come to in a second, and 5 million pounds with our property fund with Ccla. The reason for this high cash flow at the moment is twofold. One is that we received a pensions top-up grant from the Home Office for 83 million, and we received that kind of quite early in the financial year, so it leaves us with quite a large sum of cash. In addition to that, really there's been a lack of suitable counterparties with who we can invest. Local authorities, as we mentioned at the last Joint Audit Committee, we're clearly careful about, but also other banks offering very, punitive rates, really, just kind of very, sometimes you get 1 basis point for 6 months, and it's just not worth investing with. As a result of that, the Treasury management policy does have a limit that we have with NatWest, which is 65 million. We have breached that on several occasions over the past few months for those reasons. So it's only right that I bring that to the attention of the board. Some reassurance over that is that NatWest still is kind of partly state-owned, so it is partly backed by the government, so there is some reassurance over that. The current average rate that we're kind of achieving on our investments is 5 basis points, and that's similar to the benchmark, which is the SONIA, which is a sterling overnight index rate of 5 basis points. The budgeted investment return for the year is 520,000, and that is in line with what we expected it to be. And we set the budget with the expectation that the Bank of England base rate would stay at 10 basis points for the year. For the first time this year, we've utilised money market funds. So we've invested 30 million with the Ccla money market fund. That doesn't have a maturity. We can withdraw it at any point in time immediately, and we're achieving about 2.5 basis points on that. But it's a good tool to utilise. Brief update on the £5 million with investment with the Ccla property fund. That's delivered a performance of 3.75%, and it's in line with the overall kind of benchmark, and we expect that to perform overall. That performance is fairly good, to be honest, given the kind of COVID impact on property prices over the last 12 months. Moving on to section 5, credential indicators. They are all in line with what we set in the Treasury management strategy. I don't intend to go into those in any detail unless any of the board members have a question on that. But just to say, in kind of 5.3, the PCC has not undertaken any borrowing so far this financial year. Borrowing will be taken out when we've got an update on the estate strategy and where we want to go with that, really, and can understand when it's optimal to borrow. Clearly, now is a good time to borrow because interest rates are so cheap, but we don't want to borrow in advance of need because then we'll be unnecessarily paying interest when we don't need it. And so, yeah, that's about it for the paper. Appendix 1 lists our current investments, and Appendix 2 is a list of our current borrowing. All of our current borrowing has been applied to finance the state strategy, so there's no borrowing outstanding to be applied, and we're paying an average rate of 3.3%. When we've got a clearer steer on where we're going with the estate strategy, we will review our borrowing and whether it makes sense to pay off some of these loans early, because we do have a large cash balance at the moment. But just to note that the Public Works Loan Board will apply a penalty if we do pay any loans early. So we've just got to weigh that risk benefit up, really.
Thank you. That's very clear. For anyone who's struggling with all of these acronyms, I'm just going to Ccla. I've always had an interest in it because I briefly, for a while I sat on its board. Ccla stands for Churches, Charities and Local Authorities, and it's actually a body. It was set up to provide a vehicle for local authorities at the point at which Right to Buy came in, and district councils found themselves with huge amounts of capital receipts and weren't allowed to spend it and needed somewhere safe and sensible and it was set up at that point. So I don't know whether its structure is still the same. It used to have a little. I mean, it has a investment management company that runs it, but it did have a sort of monitoring board that was still made up of local councillors. That was 20 years ago now, so I better not remember it. Anybody else? Richard?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for having me, and Mark, so I can see your co-author on the report. I'm trying to link it to the corporate risk register. It's risk 10, financial management, which identifies there are some unfunded inflationary pressures. So picking up about your point about inflation's going up. And I don't know if it's you or Mark or you and Mark. What does that look like in terms of the current medium-term financial position, in terms of the gap then, in terms of the effect of inflation on our financial position?
So we are currently updating our medium-term financial plan. That gap can potentially be significant for us moving forward, because clearly most of our inflation is potentially pay inflation, incremental progression, and also general inflation as well around things like fuel at the moment and other things. So that's something we're doing at the moment, and every year that gap or that amount tends to be between about 10 and 15 million pounds a year, and it all kind of bakes into whatever the police funding settlement is for next year, which we won't know about potentially at the end of October when the government announced the budget, but more likely the police funding settlement's announced late early winter. It is a considerable gap, but it has to be sort of baked into the whole settlement.
And do you absorb any unfunded gap from reserve?
No, we tend not to. This year, for example, we had a savings target of £3 million, which was forced to actually going through a priority-based budgeting review to actually find that gap as such. And in the past, we've used reserves to fund the change programme rather than a budget gap.
Supinder?
Thanks, Chair. I just want to compliment you, really. It's a really good detailed report. I like it. But it's time to get political now. So, interest rates. I disagree with you. I think, if anything, interest rates will probably rise next year. I think 2023, 24, we're looking at general election. We won't want to look at any interest rates rising, anything, they'll stabilise. If we are going to see a rise, possibly, my personal opinion, we'll see it next year, 2022. Judging by the report you've laid out, I think we're planned ahead for that anyway. I think we can sustain anything. Just one thing I want to pick up on, though, is even though the maturity is actually round the corner now, National Bank of Kuwait. You know, somebody like me, an old-timer who can remember way back 30-odd years when banks were going, you know, people invested in banks from other countries and they were falling. Is this something that's a one-off, or is it something that we're going to, again?
Okay, so we only invest with counterparties according to a credit rating list. So link our Treasury management advisors and providers with a credit rating list of any kind of suitable counterparties. And as per the Treasury management strategy, we will only invest in banks with a rating of F1 or higher. And that's for the short term. So F1 is something that's used by Fitch, but in other banks, in other rating terms, it's like it's A or above, so A or A plus.
A plus.
Yeah. So it's only with banks who have their subsidiary or their kind of base in the UK. So the National Bank of Kuwait clearly is in Kuwait, but they have the bank that we're investing with resides in the UK. But to give you some assurance around that, the National Bank of Kuwait has a credit rating at the moment of F1 plus for any investments under 12 months. NatWest actually has a lower credit rating than them for less than 12 months. So we would only do it with, you know, banks that have a suitable credit rating, really.
Yeah, okay. I'm just looking at the interest rate as well, 0.8%. It's not huge, is it, really, to see where you're coming from, but yeah, I'm pretty respectful, that's all.
You're absolutely right. In terms of kind of risk reward, it's not a huge amount. But if you take out the property investment, which is bringing around kind of 300,000 in dividends, the interest rate on the other investments was bringing about 200,000 of income. And for me, that pays for you know, 5-6 police officers on the front line. So as long as we're doing it with a counterparty that's a suitable risk, I think it's a risk reward worth having. you know, there are other counterparties that will pay us half a basis point, 1 basis point, you know, domiciled in other countries, but we won't touch that because I think that risk is too much for us. And you're right to mention the previous banking crisis in 2008-9, where some local authorities lost money with Icelandic banks and things like that. And that is the reason why we stay within the UK, really, because within the UK, there as a result of the banking crisis in 2008-9, there are certain regulations that have been brought in, so the ring fencing of deposits from institutions and from individuals. So we're protected to some extent. And if another banking crisis was to happen, we never know. By the time it's unfolded, because they're short-term in nature, I believe would be relatively safe.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Thank you very much, Ravi, for your report and responses to questions. We'll move on to the insurance update. We've got Janie with us to bring us up to date.
I think we've all had a chance to read through the paper, but for the benefit of the new board members, the background of the insurance program is that it can be quite challenging to find an insurer, take the insurance on board. So at the top of the insurance program is the car, the property and the assets, and then we would call it casualty. So the casualty would be the employer's liability, public liability and motor liability insurances. The easiest one to deal with would be the property and assets insurance. We arranged that in conjunction with the report as part of the consortium, but we don't have much of a problem there. The rates are really good. The biggest problem there is staying on top of estates and changing matters that are going on in the board, but that pretty much sails through without too much of a challenge. If we move on to the Treasury programme, that's where we have a problem. When we've been out to tender the last twice, we've only effectively had one insurer that's willing to insure the board. It's coming up to renewal on the 1st of November for this year. I'm not sure what that's going to be, but I think we are going to be looking at even more difficulties, and around that we traditionally look at blending the level of self-insurance, policy excess, against the premiums that the insurers will charge. I've put in there, we haven't got that much of a pushback to insurers when you're looking at some of the claim figures that are coming through on some of the catastrophic losses, particularly in the blue light arena. I think I said in there that one of our neighbouring forces has got 2 motor claims at £15 million each. So you can see from that the insurers are reluctant to step into the market, and if they will step in, the rates they're looking to charge are a challenge, and the only way that we can blend that is to increase our level of self. Manage our claims tightly, come in, do some in-house, we do some externally. Something that we don't have a budget for, we have a provision in terms of the claim, because we have little control in terms of what claims are going to come in. Apart from on the motor risks, we can train our drivers and all the rest of it, but we are still flying around in the city on blue lights, and the risk of taking out a pedestrian is always going to be there. That then, as it can be the developments in medical science. I've said there, people are surviving catastrophic incidents. That means the value of the claim is just there. The £15 million claims are both young lads that will need care for the rest of their lives. That's where you get £15 million from. So securing probably remains a challenge, is the upshot of that. The way the force is developing brings an internal challenge to stay abreast of all those changes and make sure that we are identifying the risks that we're facing, evaluating them and deciding whether we keep them in-house or we transfer them through the insurance route, assuming that we have got an alternative transfer through the insurance route if we get it. I think it's much the same for me as it has been. Any questions?
Thank you, Janie. Charmaine?
Have you identified who would be viable insurers? Within the companies that you may look at to actually...
We go out to tender,
Okay.
but in the public sector, traditionally, there'd only usually be 2 or 3 that would ever engage in by public sector, I mean, all the emergency services and local authorities.
don't use three insurers ordinarily, and that is just getting a smaller and smaller group because there's just no money in the pot for them to want to do it really. And I think the nature of the blue light book, they will call it, all the courses, is that we may have a claim that was coming today. Let's say it's a fatality, we would notify the insurers, they may reserve 200,000, and then it would just be closed down while investigations went on. Then when it's reopened, when the criminal side is finished, the reserve might go from 200,000 to 4 million. So it's just that long tail nature can be a problem, and the insurers, they just don't want it. It is the truth, really. Many years ago, there used to be a mutual insurance company, which was not for profit, but that was a nightmare. They definitely went bankrupt. The thing is, with the casualty programme, we could have a claim today that goes back 15 years. That insurer, 15 years ago, has had all the premium, but then could be faced with dealing with a claim for that period of time. They always say child abuse claims for your local authority social services, noise-induced deafness that people would claim, asbestos-related claims, all of those types of claims would sit with the same insurers. Their profitability is bathroom really, and they're just all gradually pulling out the market.
Thanks for your report, really interesting. Can you foresee a time when there won't be an insurance company that will provide insurance, and if that happens, what's the process that follows?
That's a really good question. I think we are moving ever more towards that. I don't think there'll ever be a time when we won't be able to get insurance, but what will happen is we will just be forced to take higher and higher levels of excess. I think we're at 500,000 at the moment. I think the Meta is about 7.5 million. I know GMP, as a large force, we do really well. Because we regularly have meetings with counterparts and business forward. I think there will always be an insurance market, but I think it will be the level at which we can get cover from. And I think, facing that, we can only do what we can do, which is identify the risks, manage them as best we can, and then we'll have to go to our accountants and colleagues to say we need to top up the insurance fund. All that. We've got nowhere to go, really. Just stay abreast and horizon scan.
Just to follow up then to Martin, to meet you. In respect of, is that accounted for it then in reserves? Is that where that money would come from?
Yeah, so the way it's accounted for, we've got a budget allocation pay into the funds as well as got a reserve for claims as well. We have got money, we assess that reserve on a regular basis to make sure it's right.
Every claim we know about, we have a reserve allocated into the insurance fund. Those reserves are regularly reviewed to make sure that they're not too light and not too high. So that as far as we can, everything that we know about, we have already made a provision for in the insurance fund. Obviously, if we've got a claim today that's reserved to £1 million, we only have to put 500,000 into the fund because that's all we're exposed to. But I think I've got in the report, it's a bit technical, but there's also something called an aggregate stop loss with the insurance pitch. So if we had a particularly bad year, in 10 years, for this year's insurance, we've paid 7 million, the excess will fall away. We will then be insured with no excess. That's always pitched at such a level that we should never get there, but it is something for us.
Something to strive for.
Yeah, but we do, yeah, and we do try to put something into the insurance fund for claims that we haven't yet received. We know will come. We've got 3 years typically to be injury.
Bupinder.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to say, this is a difficult report, isn't it? And I don't envy it. You're right. I mean, going back 10 years, it was a different ball game. Now it's changed. For me, I look at it, my analogy, you're going down a road and it's getting narrower and narrower. You know, it is getting difficult. Are we going to come to that time very soon where, you know, insurance companies are going to turn around and go, sorry, you know, because you're right. We have got that scenario where we can insure the company for X amount of years and a claim pops up. It went on for 10 years. You know, it's difficult. It really is difficult. And I don't envy you, but thank you for this report. Thanks.
Thank you. I think some time ago, some local authorities ceased insuring primary schools. The premium was such so great, and you took if one school burns down every 2 years, then replacing it is actually cheaper than the insurance that you're being asked to pay. So and it's not just about the profits, it's about the dividends that they're wanting to pay to the shareholders, and they won't put those at risk. So, what I would agree with everyone on is I actually think that Jamie and her team do a wonderful job here in actually ferreting out good deals and, having relationships with companies that allow us to, at the moment, continue to have a premium. So thank you and well done. Okay, so thank you. It's about 10:40. We're now coming to an item that I think will generate a good deal of discussion. So I'm going to suggest that we just have a very quick 5-minute comfort break, which will allow Janie to get out of the room and all of us to fill up our cups of water, and then we'll get on to the internal audit update.
There we go.
Okay, we will resume our meeting and hope that we're still audible to anyone listening in. We've reached the internal audit update. Lynn, do you want to make some overarching comments before we look at the individual reports? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So just to give you a summary of the report and a little bit of background for some of the new members. So we finalised 3 audit reports in the quarter since the last meeting, and we had 2 in draft. One we've now received management comments for, so that will be finalised shortly and come through to the next meeting. On top of that work, we've also followed up on 26 audits in terms of progress on their recommendations, and we're around sort of 87% in terms of the implementation, which is on a par where we were last quarter as well. So that's showing really good performance. I think if Appendix 4 in the report shows the significant recommendations that are outstanding, but I think from the updates that I've given you there, which have come from management, the majority of those are actually showing some good progress, so I'm fairly confident they'll eventually get closed off shortly. Given a little bit of background around the National Fraud Initiative, so for the purpose of the new members, this is where we provide data from our systems, so from our creditor systems, payroll systems and pension systems to the Cabinet Office, and they match it with data from other public sector organisations, Department for Work and Pensions, and they come back with potential matches that we really need to investigate to see if there's been any fraud or error. So we've got over 2,000 matches that were sent back to us, varying quality. They're given a quality grade. And we focused initially on the deceased pensioners, just to basically, if any pensioners have passed away, we put stuff on their pensions. And now we're looking to calculate overpayments for those. And we've also there was about 1,200 matches that were associated with potential duplicate creditor payments. We focused on the high quality matches, which there were about 250, and I think it's quite, in a way, reassuring that we've only identified 6 at the moment from those 250, and the value of those 6 is 193,000. So I'm encouraged by the low numbers that we're finding. It's just, obviously, the value for those 6 is quite high. But just to update the committee, that 165,000 of that has actually already come back into the organisation through the recovery that were instigated as a result. So there's about 30,000 left to come back in, but we are in the process of recovering that. In terms of audit performance, the one that will look low to members is the plan position. But just to reassure you, it's always low at this time of year, and it's in the last quarter that we'll see that rise to sort of the planned level. The beginning of the year is really dedicated to planning and preparation for audit to start, and we have a lot of annual leave in the early part of the year. So that will level out, and in terms of where we're at, about 50% of our audits are actually underway. Making a link back to the risk register that we the item we had earlier, there has been a lot of fluctuation in risk. So I have got a meeting with the deputy set up during October to actually take stock of where we're at with the plan and whether any revisions are actually needed, which we'll bring back. In terms of the audits that were finalised, members will have read Appendix 1, which summarises 2 audits that received minimal or limited assurance. The first one was in respect of late and serious sexual offences. I think the timing of this coincided with a national review that was underway between HMIC, FRS and Her Majesty's Crown Prosecution Service Inspectorate. And the findings of our audit were quite similar to the findings that came out of that national review in terms of insufficient trained officers, lack of supervision reviews, gaps in victims' contact, and the lack of joined up work with CPS. So I think the things that we found are similar to what other forces, the position of the forces too. I know the force are aware of these issues, and there's an action plan that's been agreed with the force executive team, which I'm sure members will be updated from Annie and DCC Jardine. We have agreed a series of management actions, and we will follow the results in the normal way. Also highlighted the accounts payable process, so this is given limited assurance. And again, I think what we saw here, we took a slightly different process with this one and took more of a data analytical review. And what we did identify some issues in the duplicate payment report, where it wasn't actually bringing the data back correctly, which meant that some potential duplicates have not been reviewed. But there are some compensating processes there that the National Fraud Initiative would have identified duplicates, which we will have investigated up to October 2020. We've recommended that management do a retrospective exercise from October 2020 onwards to iron out any duplicates that might have happened in that period. And also, what we found was because of staff shortages and absences during the COVID period, some management controls have slipped, and some of those were key controls, so we've had to make recommendations to put those controls back in place, which management has done. And we've also had an update that work is now underway to resolve the duplicate payments report and the BACS report issue. And a meeting is going to be held today about the BACS issue, so we can give assurance around the processes that are proposed for that. So that's a very brief summary of what's in the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I've also got Gemma Brooks from my team who did the LASSO piece, and Detective Superintendent Anastasia Miller is here as well to answer any questions. Anastasia is the subject matter expert for LASSO. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. So as you pointed out that we've got Anastasia, welcome, and Gemma with us for that. Should we start at that point to see if there are any questions on the rape and serious sexual offences report first? We'll start with that and then we'll move on to other items in the report. So,
yeah. I think there's just kind of three, some might run together. So on page 8, we talk about unallocated reports that haven't been allocated during investigation. So there's a question about what's happening with them, how that's going to be dealt. And then the second paragraph below that talks about the Home Office counting rules and what's been crime, and then the police having to go through a process to notify them. And it talks within there about having repeat demand callers, so I assume that's people with vulnerability who are making additional calls anyway. I don't know if those two pieces fit together, as in some of those allocated reports to those no fines, but really about how that piece is being managed. There's a lot of demand and there's a lot of work there to manage all of that. First question. If you like the others, would you like to?
No, I'd like to jump in that would be great, thanks. So, you touched on a few points there. Understandably, and this picture is replicated nationally, you've seen an increase in demand in terms of RASO year on year. That very briefly dipped at the beginning of COVID, but then soon picked up to previous levels, actually rising on previous levels. So it's been well publicised in terms of the improved compliance with recording crime, which is very positive, and also that increase in reporting, so it's given us a bit of an uplift in demand also. But with that, as you say, comes to the first point around, are there unallocated reports, and is that a result of the crime reporting? No. So I know there was a period earlier in the summer where we were dealing with challenges around reporting and meeting the demand we had and looking at prioritising where the threat and risk sits using our internal model of Thrive to understand, what we needed to prioritise first. So there was a moment where the demand was such that we did have a slower investigation in terms of prioritisation. There was nothing that wasn't unallocated. What happened was that it would take longer for us to investigate the crime. So during that period, we escalated through force processes and through tasking up to the board of executive team, and we were giving support from external departments to help support bringing that number of reports down to a manageable level under the supervision of specialists, RASO investigators. That happened, and that now is zero. So there is no unallocated as a term in the system. So that's a short-term sort of injection of staff that was provided to help support that, and we've achieved that. And then we've had some new staff coming in, year 3 students and other members of staff from other areas that have got experience. So a blend of workforce coming into the RASO world that helps support that and means that we can sustain where we're at now. And in terms of the crime recording and the repeat demand, so yes, we do have, we're trying to understand the FEA as we use that and within that around mental health, etc. The challenges around no crime, and yes, there is a process to follow to no crime, and work through that, and there are challenges within that, but that isn't causing us to have unallocated crime reports, so those are two.
And I take it within that discussion about the repeats where there's a vulnerability, that's a partnership approach.
Absolutely, it has to be, because it can't be, it can't be a single approach, to external within our force, the neighbourhood colleagues to help support with that around the people. But that works ongoing.
And of course, in that, particularly all sorts of information, but particularly for RASO, your ratio of new students to experience. What's the succession planning then? Because reading some of the reports, you've got a lot of experience leaving the course or moving on to other aspects of policing, and a lot of student officers. What are we doing to make sure that those student officers are getting, and there's a plan now to fill the gap? That is obviously.
Absolutely. So the expectation is that when officers or staff come into the sort of specialist world that is RASO investigations, that's serious sexual offences and honour-based abuse and various very serious sort of domestic offences, is that they are PIP 2 qualified, so that's have a detective accreditation when they come into the department or are aspiring to be detectives. You've rightly pointed out that we have had students come into us, year 3 students, that we are experiencing the challenges of people leaving the organisation and then having quite a young workforce. So that brings its own benefits in terms of digital awareness and all the benefits that bringing that into the organisation, the challenges around that experience, that actually they need time to bed in and to learn. So We have 90 officers and staff going through the detective development programme over the next 12 months within force that will bring benefits into our department specifically. But in terms of those Year 3 students that have landed in and we've got now, and the people that need upskilling, so we have put a short to medium term plan in place. Everybody knows because of the global pandemic, the ability to deliver training was significantly reduced, so we weren't able to deliver the specialist sexual offences course to officers as we want to. That paused in February 2020. We explored digital, virtual sort of remedies to that with our learning and development colleagues, but it's the course that needs to be delivered face to face for sort of really obvious reasons and you know how important it is. So that wasn't possible. So we are tabling those in. Those start very shortly. So in the interim, we have a post that's within public protection currently where we're delivering the really critical training with College of Policing around delivering it outside the scope of the Detective Academy, and that's that kind of specialist rape investigative response, so going out and understanding how to deal with a victim, a traumatised victim, and the process that needs to be followed. So that training is being delivered by that individual, and that's being rolled out as we speak, so that gives us some reassurance, and absolutely new staff are not left to attend, take a victim to a SARC, you know, a specialist rape centre with no experience. We have those non-government organisations, you know, the ISVAs, the Independent Sexual Advisors, who are there with the victim also quite often, and the medical professionals that ensure that, you know, the victim is having that right support. But we're using coaching and mentoring within the experienced staff that we've got in the department also to support those new individuals. And also, there's mention of victims are interviewed, video interviews, when we speak to them, and there has been there was a skills gap identified around that training, so that has been picked up, and we've now got 90% of our staff, well, the staff in the last 2 months have now been trained in that vulnerable interview technique, which is really crucial in terms of getting best evidence. So that's a really positive news story that we're really pleased about, because actually putting this post in place has enabled us to do that. And then moving down the line, clearly we need to upskill, fill the experience gap in the frontline officers, those that sometimes, you know, that see that victim firsthand, is making sure that they are equipped and have an enhanced knowledge. So Ops Sentinel, which is our vulnerability plan, have designed vulnerability packages which will go out to all frontline officers that's in train now around enhancing their knowledge when dealing with victims. So putting all that together with the post that we've got around this continued professional development that's dealing with the criticality of the training within the RASO world at the moment will be expanded out to departments such as force response to ensure that they have the skills that they need, so that when they're dealing with a victim of rape, that they can, you know, give the best service, trying to put that the right resource in the right place.
Deputy Chief Constable who wanted to come in, Vanessa.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in on a point. I think this is a well-rehearsed point, but I think it's important that the board, you know, hears it again probably, and I make no apology to that. You know, policing absolutely welcome the uplift that officers, you know, from the 10,000 from the government, 10,000. Absolutely welcomed it. But of course, there is a consequence to that in that those officers come in brand new, and if I say that 20% of our workforce at the moment is less than 2 years, you know, this is a policing and a national policing issue. And I think Annie's described very well there the processes that we've put in place. And the board will be well aware of the priority-based budgeting process that I chaired last year to allocate staff to the most critical areas of the organisation. So we did it in a very informed way, rather than just saying fill vacancies. We assessed risk and put officers in, of which RASO was absolutely one of the primary ones. One advantage of a force like West Midlands Police, and I say this in a very sympathetic way, and it's not meant in any other way regarding victims, but is that officers in a force such as this do gain experience very quickly, because of unfortunately, the number of incidents that they deal with and the seriousness. So I know some of my colleagues, for example, to use an analogy, who are firearms commanders in other forces, may only command 1 or 2 firearms jobs a year, and therefore their experience, you know, remains relatively low. Here in West Midlands Police, they will manage probably 1 a week. And it's very, unfortunately, but similar in this organisation, in that our year 3 students that Annie's talking about will deal with a significant number of these serious incidents, with the mentoring, with the coaching, support with them, so that they do become experienced, relatively quickly, and will deal with a broad range of victims and gain that experience that perhaps their counterparts in other more rural forces won't gain. But it's a valid point, but I think hopefully Annie's explained, that the processes that are on the way.
Yeah, absolutely, and a very positive picture of what we're trying to achieve there. But clearly, what also comes out here is that officers have only got so many hours in a day to do what needs to be done. It can't come at you. Absolutely. I guess it's about the succession planning that follows on, because at some stage, hopefully, you'll get an opportunity to match that resource and demand about what you want those future teams to look like.
Absolutely so, and I think in terms of the training and increasing that capability through the detective programme, the capabilities of those detectives as they come through, and the productivity they then bring in the workload they are able to carry is such that it will soften or reduce that stress that's felt across sometimes less experienced, because then naturally they can carry more workloads quite often. In terms of our structures, etc., we're always looking at how we can improve, where can we build capacity, what can we do differently. So there have been ongoing consultations with staff, sort of multiple virtual consultations over the last few months, because they're the practitioners, they're experiencing it at the sharp end and understanding what can we do differently. So really trying to bring them in on the conversation, but also looking at how we deal with offences, whether our operating model, is as it should be, always looking at what our demand is to see if we can do something differently or better, whether it's around non-mutant offending, whether it's around the live risk of basically live rapes. We're certainly scoping at the moment with private companies that looking at that, building capacity, bringing them in to sort of review, look at our operating model, and do a programme of work, approximately 14 weeks, that we then implement and see if we can build capacity, improve our performance. And I think we talk about outcomes as being our performance, improving our outcomes, but I think certainly what I feel really passionately about in terms of trust and confidence with the victims is actually we need to give them the best experience and keep victims on board and learn from these victims quite often, because it's such a difficult offence to report, and every touch point they might have with an individual in the police force would re-traumatise them. So it's really important that staff know how to deal and are equipped to deal with those victims. So
bearing in mind what you've just said, that every contact could be traumatising, nonetheless, how far are we able to consult and talk to victims about their experience of what we're doing? Because you talk to staff, but what are victims going to see that's different? If you were making comparisons with people, you may not have the data, but how far is it possible to actually consult with people who have experienced these crimes and have experienced how we're handling it?
So I know that this is a really challenging area around the sensitivities of doing that, but something that is mentioned in the report that I've discussed as well about how we do that. So we're currently engaged with, obviously, the providers, and one of those is Black Country Women's Aid, where we are imminently launching a pilot starting beginning of November, where we directly dispatch to any scene of a rape, live rape, with an ISBA and with a police officer, and that's a pilot to look at actually, do we give a better service, because we're putting a specialised resource immediately there and with that third sector support. And actually what we hope to then get out of that as well is an evaluation with some feedback, and it's really challenging getting feedback from victims because of that re-traumatisation. So we are looking to partners to help support that, but I do feel that sometimes the victim voice is absolutely missing, and we need to hear it because we need to understand what their experience is, and we can't be too scared to hear that because we're worried about the sensitivities. We absolutely have to risk assess all of that in terms of if we're talking about a domestic setting and the risks of trying to get feedback, but we need to have an understanding of how a victim feels. It's something that we're actively exploring at the moment.
I think Charmaine wanted to come in and then Vanessa.
My question was about the recruiting for your area. And is it more gender-based, or would you be looking to kind of however they come, or is it more gender-based? I think I was looking at somewhere where the victim will have an opportunity to kind of say if she would prefer to have a female officer or
Yeah, so in terms of the victim code, a victim will be able to choose the gender of the interviewer. So when a victim deals and it is being interviewed, so absolutely, and we strive to achieve that where we can now. If the victim asks us for a specific gender, then absolutely we strive to cater for that. Public protection, as a department, does have more of a female workforce than it does a male workforce, but we do have more males coming into it than we did previously, and the balance is getting better, but it's more heavily weighted towards female staff working within it. So we do strive to do that now. It's something that obviously the victim code stipulates, and we must comply with that. Absolutely, we're working towards achieving that, and we always try to give the victim the opportunity to be able to give the best evidence and have the best experience. But I think part of it is us reassuring that victim that the service they will get will be from a specialist officer.
You want to come back in?
It was just a very quick point, if I may, Chair. You know, one of the, when I was in Annie's role in Manchester, that we managed to do was to set up a group with the CPS of equivalent of children's aid and rape victims, and set up a forum where rape victims were able and willing to help us not only give feedback but to shape policy of the future. Now, I know previously that we were unable to do that here, but with a new head of CPS, that might be something that we can again approach just with staffing and resources. But there was a huge amount of value. I think it's a really good point around seeking feedback and and then taking it further with politics.
Just say involving getting the victim's voice in these processes is a really good thing to do. However, it's not like we don't know what victims are saying. You know, in Force, led by the OPC, there was the Vulnerable Victims Report that covered all aspects of vulnerability and is very clear on what was needed from a review of policing and delivery. The Victims Policy Team have just concluded 12 months or more of asking that very question of our services and the victims within that. And the National Victims Commissioner from 2015, 2018, 20 both domestic violence and Vera Baird, has been very clear on what victims want. What that needs to be translated into is we know what victims want. They're not wishing to hold the airways here. I've just got one other question. On the page 23 of the audit report, it talks about domestic abuse serial perpetrators, but specifically about 1 day, 1 conversation. And that seems to have grown into a kind of process. Could you just explain kind of what that's about and how that's come to be instead of being like that formalised data exchange?
No. I can't even find the page. Well, page 23 online is on follow-up.
Yeah, that is the follow-up.
Okay. Right. Sorry.
Serial perpetrators.
Yeah. Jumped out of speakers. Well, I can stop talking now.
Okay. Richard.
Thanks, Anastasia. I'm mindful of Vanessa's contribution about kind of it's an intense and steep learning curve. Just a couple of points. One, how sustainable is that? And particularly the measures about kind of reallocating, I think that's on paragraph 2 of page 8, about kind of moving resources internally, if I've read that right. Does that create a pressure elsewhere? I'm sure it inevitably does. I guess the wider point is kind of how did we get here? What were the kind of red flags or warning signs along the way there? Because this seems kind of, they've all kind of reached ahead kind of at the point. I don't know at the time of Gemma's audit. It's never a good time to be audited, I know. Just keen to get your thoughts on, did we see this coming as an organisation?
Okay, so in terms of how we got here, to deal with that one first, so absolutely, it does seem quite timely in terms of the end-to-end rate review and the HMIC FRS, but what we're experiencing is what is being, and Martin's alluded to it, is being experienced nationally. I think we have a young workforce, so the demands then on training increase. We've got PQS, we've got the Detective Development Programme, all of which require learning and development input. The global pandemic doesn't assist then in terms of trying to deliver that training. So when that hit, you know, the timetable that was planned was significantly impacted. So that definitely had a part to play in terms of identifying that there's a flag as a trigger. So the training and development and capability was escalated to risk register level in public protection. There were then ongoing conversations and presentations up to fourth executive team. And as a result of that, then there were mitigating actions put in place, and part of that was that temporary injection of staff. And absolutely, every action has a consequence and an impact, doesn't it? So that absolutely does. But in terms of dealing with the risk around managing that demand for a period of time, knowing that further staff were coming in on a more permanent basis, was a necessary step, both to, you know, ensure that we were timely investigating the offences, and we did that, and so it's sustainable in the sense that we have cleared where that blockage was. We have got more staff coming in, they are embedding, we are looking and training, so their capability will increase. We are also expecting further incoming staff from the Detective Academy as that progresses over the following months. So actually it will be sustainable, notwithstanding there are clearly challenges around it, but yes.
And if I may, Chair, just you know, to take us, you know, that pipeline is really specific, but yes, I think we did foresee this, but I think until we began recruiting, we haven't recruited for 5 years, and you know, again, stating the very, very obvious, and I make no apologies, that the force significantly reduced in size, over 2,000 officers, and very difficult decisions were made. So I think we would be naive, Chair, to sit here in front of you and the board today to say we didn't foresee this coming, but I think it was very limited around what we could do. I think now that we've got the recruitment, and it perhaps goes up to answer some of the CAP's questions as well, around that longer term approach. Our approach for recruitment is over the 3-year period, and we are very much looking at 1, 2 and 3 years as to how we can invest. Want to add to that?
Yeah, I want to move on. Is it a new point?
No, carry on.
Okay. So I think we've asked some searching questions there. There's clearly a significant amount of work still to be done. So what's the timescale for the follow-up to be done?
I was going to suggest that we delay from the usual 6 follow-up, because it seems that there'll be a lot of things in play and we won't be able to see what the impact of that is. So if we could push it back to 12 months, would that be reasonable with the committee?
I think we've seen in the past that where we're quite anxious about something, we've asked for a 6-month follow-up, and then actually we haven't given people time to embed and make changes. So is the committee comfortable with a 12-month period? Because that should, you know, given that you've got recruitment in place and whatever, none of that happens quickly. We'll bring it back in 12 months. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you both very much for that. Then we've also got, so I'll just stick with the report, looking at the accounts payable. So are there any particular questions? If we can let Anastasia go, we're not ask her awkward questions about that. There might be more aimed at Mark. Are there any questions on, yes, Richard, on the accounts payable report?
Can I just clarify, Lynn, is the overpayments that you talk about on page 4 of the NFI, just kind of data matching, is that related to the accounts payable?
It is the accounts payable,
okay,
but it was part of the data matching exercise. We didn't identify that 193,000 as part of the credited audit. That was already underway. That's a separate exercise.
So in terms of the amount that's outstanding, you should have 165k of that.
We had back 165,000. Yeah. There's around 30,000 that they're still waiting to come back in, but we have requested the money from the providers. As part of the routine sort of audit of accounts payable process, that's where we obviously identified that as a potential issue in this report. I think what I sort of tried to explain in my summary was that the National Fraud Initiative would have identified any matches over the 2 or 3 year data that we submitted up to October 2020, which we will have investigated. It's the ones after October 2020 that I think we need to do a retrospective exercise on to just see if we've missed any. But we, as part of the audit, we looked at an additional 3-month period. So it was quite limited what we did, and we only identified one over £500 in that 3-month period. So we're not expecting a lot of, duplicates to come from this retrospective exercise, but it's about reassuring ourselves that we've not missed anything. You will obviously get another opportunity in the next data matching exercise, which is next year.
In terms of management response to the recommended action, have we closed the gaps? They seem fairly routine financial controls.
Yeah, they've agreed to implement everything that we've asked. The duplicate payment report issue where it's put in a no in the field, we don't know the exact cause of that, so we've got to, get some, we've got IT, shared services, and potentially from the software providers to try and resolve that issue. But they are working on a solution for that at the moment. They know it's an issue, so they know that they've got to look a little bit further into it. And the problem with the management controls, they've now put those back in. A lot of routine tasks that should happen on a weekly or a monthly basis that obviously slipped because of resourcing issues during COVID. They're now obviously brought those back in once we've pointed out that they're key controls and they need to operate. We have a meeting today to talk about the solution on the back report.
So, just picking up that point about the local controls and, picking up the points that were made in the accounts payable audit. During the pandemic, we asked lots of questions at the audit committee about what the risk registers were, about the impact that COVID was having. And quite rightly from Jonathan, he's got the occasional answer, well, some of that is operational. So clearly, in the accounts payable, it's a local and operational risk that people leave and understanding of processes is lost. But whilst the report says local managers didn't approve dropping or some controls, I suppose the question is also there, well, were the local managers still in place, and had they, was there ever a point at which there was a risk register operation which said there's a risk that key controls may not being applied because people aren't there or people have left? I'm just thinking about the role of the local managers in this, in terms of, they weren't asked to approve it, but had they spotted it? Or was it only the audit that spotted it?
No, I don't think that's some of these. They knew that particular tasks weren't being done because there was no resource, but I don't think there was an understanding of the significance of the tasks. Yeah. And that is possibly because they did have a lot of experienced people that were involved in setting those controls up that left the organisation. And it's easy to not do a task if you constantly do it and never find any issues. Yeah. But there is a point to doing it, and that's not to find issues, which was the situation with the back report. So shared service in particular did lose a lot of experience staff. They've had a new assistant director come in, they've had a lot of service managers changes. So I think it was that corporate knowledge that was possibly lost in terms of why the controls were there and set up in the first place, because a lot of them are controls as well.
It kind of taps into some of Stacey's point about experienced and knowledgeable people leaving the organisation. And I know it's really difficult because there's a lot of stuff that's just in their heads because they've been there 10, 15 years doing that sort of stuff. But is there a process to kind of capture knowledge and learning as people exit the organisation?
Not something that we particularly looked at. You would think that there are local arrangements in place, but I did notice that something's being put on the corporate risk register about that organisational knowledge, that it's possibly something are aware of, but that might be more from an operational policing perspective rather than a...
It is hard because you don't know what's inside someone's head, I guess.
You know, from my perspective, this sort of area, though, I would expect it's very transactional, so it would be procedural and process-driven, which is obviously documented rather than which is to get behind it.
Just to throw in an example of that then, where I think it's not happening is when you've got people who are the centre of excellence, the single point of contact, like Kate Jones, who's the sorting lead for the courts. She retired later on in the year, and up to this point, so she's not that far away from going. As far as I'm aware, there's no succession plan. So all that knowledge steps out the door with her. So it isn't just about systems and processes, it's about what that individual who carries, and having highlighted it, I guess that would be good to look at about what is happening with that. There's a tremendous amount of work that's being done that we just ebb away.
Yes, and I mean I think that ties in with a wider point. And when I attended the Policing and Crime Board in July, I think it was, I was asked how we're ensuring that lessons are learned from particularly from the work of the audit and the audit committee. But there's a wider point, and that's a very valid point, and we will be coming to an audit report that Rob Thornton has done that actually, where we're seeing some recurring themes of things that internal audit has found in other parts of the organisation where there's still, problems are still occurring. But there is a wider problem, a wider issue, I think, about that whole issue of institutional knowledge and understanding of history and understanding of why things happen. And why things don't happen, that perhaps we might need to come back to and just give some more thought to, because it's a very big organisation, it's a very complex organisation, and it is an organisation in which a lot of people move a lot of the time. So it's a key control, if you like, that actually the knowledge and expertise that people have is captured somewhere and isn't lost when they move or retire or. So we'll give some thought to how we pick that up, because it's too big a question to raise at the moment. Okay, for Pinder?
Yes, Chair, thank you. Very quickly, I just want to go on to payments, pension payments being made to deceased members, if they have been made.
Yeah.
If they have been made, is it just an oversight, or is it fraudsters at work?
Yeah, we've had this question before, and it's quite difficult for me to answer that, because a lot of times it's because there's no next of kin to inform us that the person has passed away. So we continue to pay the pension, and because pension payslips are electronic, they're not sent out, and we often have pensioners who live abroad, there will be often a time delay before we become aware of it. So we have this National Fraud Initiative exercise, but we also have, in between that, the pensions team take part in what we call Mortality Screening through the Cabinet Office as well, which is sort of like a mini exercise where we'll pick up, from the Cabinet Office where we have potentially got some deceased pensioners, but we have to treat them very sensitively, because there have been instances where we have stopped pensions. There's been an error in somebody else's system and the person hasn't passed away. So we do try and take precautions, do as much checking as we can to get evidence of the death. But to prevent any further overpayments, we naturally put the stop on whilst we're doing those investigations. And often if somebody doesn't get paid, the first thing they do is contact us. So but it's very difficult to say whether it's a fraud, as in, somebody is deliberately not telling us, or whether, it's just an oversight and, it occurs.
Is it a common thing, or is it very rare that we...
No, I mean, my background is local councils, and this exercise was run across local authorities, and we had the same issues there. It's just a thing that happens. That I think it's that closure of the loop when somebody passes away. How does every agency get informed? And often there isn't a direct next of kin. It just takes some time for us to go through that process.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks very much for your internal audit report then, Lynn. The next item is on the public sector internal audit standards update, and this is something we effectively, it's about external assessment, how well we're doing. So you're going to make a recommendation to us on how we proceed this year?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the background to the new members, what this report is effectively about, as the Chair set out, is we, as internal auditors, do get inspected ourselves, and there is a regime that we have to go through for that inspection, and it has to be done every 5 years. So the last inspection was done in October 2017, so in the next 12 months we've got to have another re-inspection. So this paper really just sets out proposals for that, and after considering the pros and cons of each of the proposals, I think my recommendation to the committee would be, again, that we go for a validated self-assessment through an external body. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot of appetite for doing peer reviews, which would be the other option, and I think it's quite resource intensive. Small team, it's quite hard for us to absorb that resource requirement. So that would be my proposal. I've taken it to senior management who's agreed that as an option, but it's ultimately up to them.
And I mean, Lynn has discussed this with Richard and I. We said, you know, we're quite happy to have some input into the self-assessment as well, so that it's not purely, you know, the internal audit team themselves. It seemed to work quite well last. I mean, you know, the feel when we did it 4 years ago was that it was quite rigorous, and it did point out one or two things where we could improve. So is everyone happy with that as a move forward? Thank you, Nick. Okay, item 12 is update from our external auditors, Grant Thornton. Ian or Lauren, which of you is going to kick off?
I think I'll start, and then Lauren can help with any different questions. So I think it was always good to start with an apology and a bit of an explanation. So as Ravi said earlier, we were hoping that we would be in a position to issue our opinions by tomorrow, so that the accounts could be published with our opinions by the deadline of the 30th of September. That's not proved possible. I think there are 3 issues that sit behind that. We've experienced some sickness in the team right at the desk, and that's always unfortunate. And when it happens early in the process, it's possible to recover the position. When it happens so late in the process, it's just that bit harder for us to lay hands on somebody to come and help out. So that slowed us up slightly. There are though also 2 issues which are ongoing at the moment, and which we need to resolve. One of those is around the pension liability, and we've yet to receive the assurances we need from the West Midlands Pension Authority, so we're waiting for that. And there is a query that's with our actuarial team at the moment in relation to effectively one of the assumptions that GAD have used in producing the numbers that goes into the accounts. When our auditors expert, PwC, looked at that, it fell outside what they thought was a reasonable range. It's quite unusual on such a year. And so effectively, and it doesn't just impact on Western Police, it impacts anywhere where GAD is the actuary, but that's still something which we're waiting to have resolved eventually. Then the final one is we've got some work around provisions where we've got one provision in particular where we're still in discussion with management about the completeness of the provision. So whether the total liability is in the account and can be estimated at this point in time. And again, that's just taking a little while to work through. That said, the bulk of the audit is complete, and we've set out our findings in the findings report. In terms of adjustments I don't think there's nothing there which is material. There's nothing there which is particularly concerning to me in terms of there being any serious underlying issues or any problems with the systems that underpin the production of the accounts. And it's just these, one of which is unfortunate and unavoidable in terms of the sickness, and then these two, I think I'm saying their contention is devastating it, but these two issues which we've yet to fully resolve, and until we've resolved them, we're not in a position to reach a conclusion. I wasn't proposing to say very much more than that, but assuming members have had an opportunity to read the papers, I was just proposing we could take some questions.
Any questions?
Just an observation. I mean, I kind of hang on the word not material to keep me comfort.
Yeah.
Even though there are issues around provision of pension is yet to be solved.
So I think those have potential to be material, but they aren't. Pensions in particular, you only need relatively small, because of the size of the number, you only need relatively small movements to result in quite big changes. But they're not material in it's accounting technicalities rather than anything which is a serious issue.
Any other questions? We'll wait for the final report. Presumably, we're hoping will be with us.
So I think it would be yes, the final report will be. I would hope we're talking days or weeks rather than months. And so I think what we'll do is that rather than waiting until December, we'll issue with your permission, we'll issue a further version of this to committee members, maybe to you, Chair, and then press ahead and issue our opinion.
Well, that would be helpful, and perhaps once it is complete, then we can arrange for a meeting with myself, because that's something which I've valued on a regular basis in the past, and so obviously reasons haven't happened in the last couple of years, but it would be very good to do that.
I think the only thing I was going to say is that what Ravi said earlier, just to reiterate that, so although you won't have an opinion, the statutory requirement is that you publish accounts.
Yeah.
So publishing accounts and then publishing a notice which explains why there isn't an opinion is still meeting what if it's got the ECC and do that.
Yeah.
Just to think about how it went really, because we're still working in kind of COVID restrictions, and some of this work was presumably done remotely or kind of shared over some sort of digital platform.
So I think it's, and Laurie might also, so this is one of the frustrations, is this is very close to being done, and but for these last few issues we would be in a final flurry of activity, and there aren't many organisations in the current environment where I'd be in an audit committee today saying the same. So it's very challenging, and we are looking forward to being back on site or back in offices. And I think particularly where we have a business model which is based around bringing people into our organisation who don't know very much about accounting and auditing, teaching them and training them, and doing that through Teams or other virtual platforms is incredibly challenging. So it has been difficult, and thank you to Ravi and the team, frankly, because this is frustratingly close to actually being done by tomorrow, and that, so we're not talking about an audit which still has a lot of substantive work to do. We're literally talking about bottoming out a few specific issues and just paying a final bit to catch up where we've experienced some sickness. So I think it's gone well. I think we will have some form of hybrid model going forward, but it won't be. I think we've proved that auditing remotely doesn't really work for anyone.
I think I would agree with that. I think the finance team at Westminster is a lot very responsive, and they do. So we are back in a world where we get meetings. Has only been slightly hindered by remote working, I would say much less.
Sorry, very quickly, the same questions are Mark about the actual, how it's approached.
Yeah, so, I mean, from my point of view, it is relatively smooth. I think the problem we have is grant boards will rightly ask about, evidence of data and source of data. So we have to demonstrate that to them. And in a remote working environment, that can be difficult, particularly because of the sensitivities around police data and accessing our systems. So we're almost like, we want to show you this, but we can't because we can't give you access to our system. And we have to find ways around it. And the team has been very, inventive around kind of how we get that evidence across to grant boards. But when it's done person to person, it's so much more easy. We can just show them, oh, this is our screen, this is how we access the source data, and they can get that assurance. Whereas now it almost takes a bit to growing. So it probably takes much longer than it previously would have.
I just want to say sort of thank you to Ravi and his team really for sort of getting us this far and sort of given the limitations we've just talked about really well. Success, but we're just not quite there.
Good. Well, we understand why you've got these last minute hiccups, and glad to see that everyone's worked closely to almost at this point. Thank you very much. Final item on the public agenda is the work programme, which is in front of us all. Still subject to change, as it always is, and just as the internal audit plan is, if circumstances come around. But that's what we're aiming for. Thank you very much everyone for your input. That concludes the public